Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar, which is being jointly hosted by our partners, Central Square Foundation and the National Council of Applied Economic Research. I'm Shekhar Shah, the Director General at NCAER, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this very important discussion about what can be done to improve learning outcomes in private schools. I have a distinguished group of people with me, led by Mr. Anil Swarup, who was last Secretary Education, who will provide a keynote address to frame the issues that we will be discussing today. He will then be followed by Mr. Ashish Dhawan, who is the founder and chairman of the Central Square Foundation, which has released a report recently on private schools, and he will provide us a lot more details of the findings of that report. It's a seminal report, something that we haven't really had for a very long time, and therefore of tremendous importance in the context of a number of different initiatives of the Government of India, including the New Education Policy 2020. Ashish will present the report, and Truth in Advertising also requires me to say that he is a distinguished member of the governing body of NCAER. Ashish's presentation will then be followed by two experts who have researched this area extensively. Karthik Muralidharan, who is a non-resident senior fellow at NCER, but his daytime job is as the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California in San Diego. Karthik has worked on this area extensively, has published extensively in this area, and is one of our most revered active researchers in the area of education. This will then be followed by Farzana Afridi, Associate Professor at the Indian Statistical Institute, and also the lead academic at the International Growth Center in India, and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics in Bonn. Farzana will also be sharing some of her research and commenting on the report. And thereafter, we'll open it up for question and answers. And I have a set of very distinguished participants in the webinar as well. And we hope to engage them in the course of the discussion that will follow. I'm going to request Mr. Anil Swarup first to present his keynote address. Mr. Swarup has to leave by about 7:30. So if there are questions that are addressed to him, we would be glad to take those first. So with that, and without further ado, let me request Mr. Anil Swarup to give us his keynote address. Mr. Swarup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shah. What a pleasure it is to be amidst some of you who I have met before. But you know, I would probably be the least experienced person as far as school education is concerned. My exposure was only about 20 months. So I will focus on making it happen. I hope this discussion that we have today is not purely an intellectual discussion where we discuss good things, we plan for good things, and ultimately nothing happens. So we have to look at it in the context of making what we want to happen. And there are examples, because private schools have been discussed in the past, and I have been participating in some of the discussions, but nothing has happened thereafter. In fact, what gets reflected in the policy is totally different from what private schools have been asking. So why is it so? I mean, someone should look into this, because the whole objective of this exercise is to get things moving on the ground. And for that, we have to look at things that have actually happened, not probably in the context here. I'll give you one example where things happened, and we must all try and understand how did that happen to make other things happen, which we probably will be discussing today. One of the biggest problems that faces, and on account of which the private schools get a very bad name, is the fee structure. And look at how FICCI, ARISE, and UP government worked in tandem to come up with a legislation which is seminal in nature and which can actually help other states to sort this major problem out. I gave this example because when we discuss anything here, I mean, there will be great presentations, there will be a great report. In fact, in my experience of 38 years, the best of reports, including those of World Bank, never got implemented because they were so good that there was a disconnect between the ground reality and what they were saying. And in health insurance, I used to travel quite a lot to Washington and discuss with the World Bank and tell them precisely this: make an evaluation of the implementation of your reports. and then try and understand why they don't get implemented. Because the bottom line of all discussions is making things happen on the ground. Having said that, let us look at what exactly is the problem with the private schools and how can that be addressed in the context of the national education policy that's been announced. To my mind, national education policy announced is a great challenge to the private schools, and I'll touch upon that because it could actually devastate the private sector if things are not handled appropriately. Hence, it's extremely important that when you discuss, you look at those aspects and see that the damage could be controlled, and I'll tell you what could be real damage. The tragedy of our existence is that the education policy was being, when it was being formulated, when Dr. Kasturi Rangan came to meet me and he asked me about my suggestions, I said, you're wasting your time. And he was a bit surprised. He said, what do you mean? I said, see, policy is fine. You can prepare a policy, but have an action plan along with it. Because if you don't have that, then we are in serious trouble. And that's precisely what has happened. You have one of the finest education policies that you can think of. But look at the actual implementation part of it. Where is the 6% going to come in? So I will not go into the details. I will only touch upon such aspects of the policy that will impinge on private school education and probably suggest some ways forward as to what can possibly be done. Now, look at how the national education policy touches the private sector, and I'll read out what they say. It says rampant commercialization and economic exploitation by many for-profit schools. This is the understanding of the private sector in the education policy. Little realizing that 50% of our children go to private sector, and they paint with the same brush the entire thing as if there's a massive exploitation that's going on, which is very unfortunate. In fact, the national education policy misses out on a huge opportunity to get the private sector on board. Now, the job now should be to see that policy is what it is. Can it come on board? Because without coming on board, I can assure you, you can keep having these discussions and the best of people joining you, nothing will happen on the ground. So for it to happen on the ground, you have to convey to the government, because ultimately that's the ultimate decision-making authority, that we are not pariahs. We are contributing as much and perhaps more, because the bottom line is improving the quality of education. The bottom line is not government. Now, this can be done both in the government and the private sector, and that is precisely what I had been doing as school education secretary, to make the public and private understand that all the people in the public sector are not corrupt and everyone in the private sector is not making money. They're good people on other sides of the fence. Can these two good people sit together? And there was this classic example which I gave earlier, when FICCI managed to get these good people together and got it moving. It's working on the ground. Then look at the other aspect in the policy. And I'm a bit apprehensive because if it's not handled appropriately, we are going to be in serious trouble. Whereas it is absolutely correct that the conflict of interest has been taken care of in terms of creating a regulatory mechanism for schools, because earlier the same body was running those schools and the same body was the regulator. Now they're talking about a separate regulator. But that can be quite devastating if the regulator actually becomes a regulator. I wish they had named it as facilitator instead of regulator. They can still do it because, regulation means Inspector Raj. And what we need to suggest to the government now is that yes, the assessment of a school should happen, but not through a Sarkari agency. There are other agencies that are there. This can be done, perhaps will be done, but it has to be positioned in a manner that government accepts it. It's very important, because if that is not happening, then I'll tell you, this gradation of the school which the policy talks about, or assessment, whatever, of the school is going to lead a lot of corruption, because the inspectors are going to determine it. In fact, I had suggested that in CBSE also, and it would have happened, that why should CBSE people should go and assess the school? There are third-party professional agencies available. They can do the job much better. The government should accredit those agencies who in turn should certify the schools. And that can happen here also, should happen. And that is what we should discuss. We should not discuss the pedagogy and things like that. I don't think I'm good enough or competent enough to discuss pedagogy and other things. So that's another which is important. Then the policy talks about stopping commercialization of school. I agree that commercialization should be stopped. But why stop private sector? My personal take was 6% will never come, 6% of GDP. Let's accept this as a fact. As a school education secretary, I saw the actual allocation in real terms actually came down from 14 to 18. And with COVID around, this money is not coming to you. So where does the money come from? I don't know, about 6%, but the government had lost out on, or I shouldn't say government, because the policy lost out on a huge opportunity of taxing this money. Now, I know for sure that a large number of private schools are actually making money. They don't call it profit. And as luck would have it, some former civil servants run these schools. They know how to, they know the ropes. So I know what is happening there. In fact, in one of the chapters of my book, Ethical Dilemmas of Civil Servant, I talk about mafias of school education. And one such mafia is private schools. And when I say mafia, it is only a handful of them that are bringing a bad name to the entire schooling fraternity, because I was convinced that private sector is contributing phenomenally to school education. Now, let us look at some other aspects of the national education policy will impinge upon private schools. Because government may do what do, no one is going to look at them, whether something happens or not. Since we are discussing private schools, the national education talks about, the national policy talks about preschool education. Wonderful. I mean, this is probably the best part of the policy. But how it's going to happen is a very tricky affair. Because it's already happening in urban areas. You have in private schools, there are nursery, pre-nursery. You know, when my granddaughters went to the school, right now they have as many classes before class 1 as after class 1. So I don't know how many of them. In our times, we went straight to class 1. So how it's going to happen? And there, I think the private school needs to associate themselves with the government with a view to helping the government evolve. The reason is that in the government domain, preschool education, there's nothing. But in private domain, there is it. Now, in a seminar or a workshop like this, there should be a group evolving, which should be able to help the government in evolving that. Now, NCERT is working on it. But I think without partnership from those that have already experienced, it's very important. You know, the tragedy of the national education policy framers was there was not a single practitioner in that group. And unfortunately, even today, we don't have any. 5 people that are discussing are all theoreticians, experts. No practitioners sitting here. I wish they were. And I've always wanted practitioners to be a part of any discussion because they will tell you where the shoe pinches. I have a great regard for Karthik, but across the Atlantic, you have a different vision. You know, the best bit is they come to India, spend some time here, abuse here and go back to there. People who've actually soiled their hands here, the practitioners, they should come and advise what needs to be done. Structuring may be done by experts, but until you have practitioners sitting, I don't think much will happen. Then they're talking about teaching in mother tongue from class 1 to 5. Now, this is going to have implications. The good news about the policy is that they don't say it will be implemented tomorrow. But nonetheless, there. So how is the private sector going to equip? On some points, I feel threatened in the context of private sector. You're talking of improving learning outcomes. I tell you, if they have the right type of Inspector Raj, private sector could be in serious trouble. So that has to be taken care of. Then they talk about vocational training. Now, the flexibility that the policy gives requires a lot of infrastructure and a lot of redundant infrastructure. Now, it can be handled. I'm not saying it can't be handled, but people will have to keep that in mind. Then they talk about assessment system, the new assessment system. I think the most devastating part of the policy which may impact private sector is board examination from class 3, 5, 8, 10 and 12. I'm aghast. What are we trying to do to the child? In fact, this board is, when I did class 10 and 12, those board examinations were quite a hawa. So I don't know how it's going to do that. And I did mention about the new regulatory framework. Of course, there are some very positive parts of the policy. And one is this, what I've called in my book as the farcical delusion of getting 100 out of 100 in English literature probably will be taken care of, because now these marks will not determine your admission to university. I hope it happens that way. Also, the policy does well in terms of educating teachers before and 4-year B.Ed course with help. Now, what is the possible way forward in all this jungle that we have? One, I think as the government determines the objective criteria of assessing schools, the private sector should engage with the government on what should be the objective. And it can be done. What should be the objective parameters to determine that the school belongs to category A, B, C, D, or whatever that is. And then somehow convince the government into believing that let this assessment not be done by a government agency. Let there be, as I said earlier, accredited 5, 10 agencies and let them do the certification on which category. That will be a big thing if you want to improve, because otherwise everyone will be busy in somehow, like you have 100 out of 100 in English literature. Similarly, people try and get those 5 stars somehow anyhow. It can be done in the country. The second is, I think, the policy, the best part of the policy is the focus that it lays on teachers. It talks about teacher as a pivot, which I had already said, and I'm happy that the policy says that. And it's not merely a problem with the government schools and the private schools. And another problem with the private school is they are not a single category. They are outstanding schools, and they are absolutely useless schools which call themselves convent for whatever reason, because they teach in English, or they say that they teach in English. So there are all sorts of schools. So we'll have to understand what is the category within those categories and address problems relating to different. So budget schools have a different issue altogether with regard to how do they fund. Now, if they're going to follow the pattern of the government to pay the teachers the salary that the government would want them to pay, they will not be able to survive. So what's going to happen thereafter? These are aspects that will have to be looked into. And then finally, and I would like to close because if there are any questions, I'd like to take them. The COVID related challenges as well as technology related challenges. Now, technology is coming big time now. Now, what could be the role of private sector? I've been interacting almost every day. There are 2 to 3 webinars on interacting with private schools on what they can possibly do. And some of them come up with a very strange solution. Now technology can replace the teacher. I'm shocked, absolutely. Technology cannot, will not, and perhaps not replace the teacher, because technology can be great facilitator. But to what extent technology? Will it be a film hero trying to present before everyone that that's the way to learn? I think we have to look at, again, both in the joint public-private domain, to somehow assess the efficacy of all the technology that is being used. I had discussed this with Ashish long ago. Probably they are going ahead with it, but it's very, very important because we don't really know which technology is more effective as compared to the other technologies. It's a mad rush. The sexier the technology, the more people are getting it. That's why you have a Bollywood hero promoting an educational app. I mean, it can only happen in India, nowhere else in the world. But it happens in India because we project it in a manner, and I have been getting horrid reports of the way that application is working. So there has to be some way in which we convey to the public in general that this is the rating of this particular technology. To me, that's very important. Now, I can go on and on. This is a very interesting, exciting subject. And the lesser you know, the better it is, then you can speak more. But I'll stop here because I'd like to take questions if there are questions available. With the only limitation that I may have to leave at 7:30. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Always a pleasure to be amidst you all.
Thank you, Mr. Swarup, for your passionate remarks, which really do frame the challenges that lie ahead, and the fact that this is a very large part of our education system, a formative part, and if we don't handle this well, this public-private partnership well, we may be looking at a tremendously wasteful resource that will not be in the service of our young. And so for that reason, your remarks are really extremely valuable. Thank you for joining. We do have some questions, but first let me just ask the panelists, because we will not have the benefit of you're being with us for the rest of the, if any of my colleagues, Ashish or Karthik or Farzana, would like to engage with you. I have 1 or 2 questions myself, but Ashish?
I know that Mr. Swarup worked very hard on the model act that he was referring to, and UP has adopted it. So I'd request him to maybe share some aspects of that act, because I think it's a seminal act, and we should look at getting many other states to adopt this act or some variant of it at least.
Yeah, that was exactly my question. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Swarup, that seems to be a general, it would be very useful if you did that, please.
Can I answer this question first?
Please, of course. No, that's what I meant.
So for finding solution to any problem, we must understand the why of a problem. Then solution will come. In this case, let us understand the problem was not with the fee when the child enters the school, because then the parents take a decision whether they want to pay that fee or not. The problem occurs when he becomes a part of the school. Then it's a captive audience. So what we did simply in that act was to see that you charge whatever you want to charge and decide upfront when the child comes to the school. But thereafter, there has to be an acceptable formula through which you increase the fees. It's as simple as that. The rest is all legalese. And everyone accepted it. I mean, it's a brilliant legislation. And I tell you, the lack of confidence, the distrust between parents and the schools can actually be tackled through this legislation. In the sense of engaging with all the stakeholders upfront, understanding each other, and then finding a solution, bringing it on the table. So private schools also have to position themselves not as the policy says, as rampant commercialization and exploitation. If that be the perception in the government, then the moment you go to them, they will throw you out exploiters. It doesn't work that way. This needs to be dispelled. And this has been debated and debated and debated, and probably the best of reports have come out. It's not happening. So we must try and understand how to make it happen.
Farzana and Karthik, any
Yeah,
further
no, I think
questions?
just a quick follow-up on the same thing from Ashish. See, in the private school space, more generally, how much latitude do states have in terms of formulating their own regulatory principles? So if you take a simple question and saying that the approach to regulation should be based on disclosure as opposed to mandates, okay, which is kind of something I'm going to talk about, because there is so much variation. To say one cookie cutter formula that this is what a school needs to have simply doesn't work across the country. So, but I think you know, and I know that trying to change things in Delhi is just incredibly hard because of the sheer scale at which you're trying to operationalize these things. So if we can work with a few states to kind of push forward what might be model legislation of various sorts. So I think the one you described attacks one particular problem in terms of the fee increases, but the larger question of creating an optimal landscape for state and market interactions. If a state wanted to take the leadership on that, how much space does that have, and how constrained is it by kind of RTE and other national, other national frameworks?
No, RTE is not a constraint. You come across to India, live here, and then you'll be able to find a solution. Don't make that proposal across the Atlantic. It won't work here. You have to breathe here to do it. I'm telling you why. Because you'll understand what you are going to suggest, whether it will work on the ground. And this you can understand by sitting with the person who's going to suffer your suggestion.
Yeah, my question is to say, if you are
sitting, or in the private sector thinks that we have these solutions. Government said they are useless. It doesn't work that way. The two have to go. And when I gave that example of that legislation, it happened precisely that. I can still say the regulations that you're talking of, if say an organization like FICCI Arise takes it up and sits with 2-3 governments because they have developed some credentials and come up with some optimum legislation, it will be accepted by many. Someone will have to sit down, not a seminar like this where you don't have anybody from the government. There's hardly any practitioner sitting here. You will give a fantastic model and Ashish will get a fantastic report, and then we'll discuss it after a year or down the line. Again, a fantastic report. It doesn't work. I would rather have it this way. Work out those regulations. Start the discussion on that. This is the regulation, set of regulations. Now let us go para by para, line by line, and see the implication and have the state representatives sitting there. Will it work? Will it not work? Some you agree, some you disagree. And then you come on to the disagreement and discuss. That's how it is done. No general gyan. There's so much gyan in this country that we don't know how to do things. Everyone is a gyani purush. So what I would suggest to you, because you have that capacity, what you can do is, you see that in order to assess a school, what should be the broad framework? Now, NCERT or somebody may be doing it. Once you have that framework, have a focused discussion on that. I love the round table in FICCI and wherever the round table, because then you are absolutely focused physically and otherwise on that document too, because ultimately that document is going to work. And while preparing that document, you have the stakeholders sitting there, get them on board. Similarly, when you talk in terms of the flexibility, you define that flexibility and argue with them that why such a flexibility is required. I mean, when that legislation was discussed, no one thought that this fee control thing can ever happen. Parents were after them. People went to court for that also, but they didn't win it. That's how it's the approach. The process is very, very important. There's no dearth of dimag here. There's a lot of ideas and intellect.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Swarup. That was again a very impassioned plea for both being on the ground and dealing with issues at that level. We actually do have a very large number of participants whom we don't see on screen, but they are from around the country and very engaged in teaching as well as in running and analyzing private school education. Please do stay to the extent that you can stay. I'm going to move on to our presentation of the report by Ashish. and we'll then move on to discussions and comments that Karthik and Farzana will have. But I want to thank you for being with us and really raising the stakes for what is involved here. It's a generation and many generations of students, half of whom are in these private schools. And so it's a dramatically important opportunity for us to engage and to obviously improve what we are able to do. So thank you again, Mr. Swarup.
Thank you. And Karthik needs to be extradited to India.
we all try. We all try.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anil sir. Great. Thank you, Shekhar. I just wanted to set the context by saying that this report that CSF and Omidyar put out is really a collation of work done by many others. And I think what we tried to do is ensure that we acted as a neutral party as we were putting this report together. It's really a compilation of facts and some of the evidence that's out there. There's clearly a lot more research that needs to be done on the private school system in India. But I thought I'd share with you at least some of the findings. I'm sure you're familiar with some of it, but I'll quickly run you through this. I also want to thank our team, Rahul, Ruchika, and many others for the work that they did in putting this together. So I'll start just by saying, as you know, this is a very, very large private school system that we have in India. Given that almost half the children, 47.5% of children go to private schools, it's 120 million children in this system. On a standalone basis, it would be the third largest system in the world. The Chinese system, the Indian public system, and then the Indian private system, if you were to disaggregate the two Indian systems. And this is across about 450,000 schools. I think there's often this perception, which we need to correct as we build the narrative around private schools, that these are elite schools. But the truth is that 70% of the children attending these unaided private schools pay 1,000 rupees or less per month in tuition fees. So these are largely, and the median fee is at around 600 rupees per month. You know, we'll see later that there's been a mushrooming of private schools in the last 25 years, and so much so that now 16 states have a situation where more than half the children go to private schools, and yet this fact is neglected by the state authorities and the bureaucrats and others who are responsible for running the system. In total, in economic terms, the system contributes about 2 lakh crore towards the economy. So this is just a quick snapshot of the overall system. Just moving ahead, but despite this sort of massification of Indian education, where private schools played an important role in ensuring that enrollment rates went up, that not only access improved, but parents really had choice. If they wanted to exit the public system, they could have their children leave the public system. I think there are a number of issues that we still need to deal with. I think the first is that, you know, we are living in sort of the license raj. I think Karthik alluded to it. There are lots of mandates. It's very prescriptive, and it's very input-based. Second point clearly is that, you know, there's the sector is sort of not-for-profit as per the mandate of the government and the court. But the reality is that everybody's out there, or most people out there, to make a buck. But because you can't do it legally, a number of quality providers are not attracted to this ecosystem. Credit doesn't flow as easily. And I've known of a number of people who wanted to set up schools who shied away because of the sort of regulatory sword that would hang over their head. And then importantly, parents want quality, but it's hard for them to discern whether their children are going to a school which really delivers learning outcomes or not, whether it makes a difference. And then finally, you know, these schools obviously are doing, children in these schools on average are doing better than in government schools. But when you adjust for household effects, it's marginally better. But the levels are still very, very low. Even per NAS, which is, the NAS data is much below where USSR is. A significant number of children don't achieve very basic levels. 35% of class 5 children in private schools can't read second grade text. So fairly basic learning objectives have not been met. So I'll now run through the rest of it pretty quickly. And so I think what we've tried to touch on this State of the Sector report is really talk about the scale and scope of the sector, touch on the fact that learning outcomes are still a major challenge, the fact that the license Raj really operates in this sector and everything is happening sort of chori chori, chupke chupke, and we really need to look at how this regulatory framework is addressed, and this issue of reform. What can we learn from other systems, and what do we do, as Mr. Swarup was guiding us, the how of we make this system, how do we create incentives so that private school owners really want to focus on improving learning outcomes. These are some of the things I'll touch on as we go ahead, and I'm sure will be discussed later. Moving ahead, I just thought we'd provide you a quick snapshot of the sector. Just move ahead, Ruchika. So as I mentioned earlier, about 47.5% of the students go to private schools. There are about 1.1 million government schools. Each unit size of a government school is much smaller. I'll show you the statistics later. And then 47.5% of the children go to private schools, mostly to unaided private schools, but then a significant chunk, about 11%, to aided private schools as well. The growth in aided private schools, it's been stagnant, it's been flat, but we've really seen significant growth in the private unaided sector, particularly in the last couple of decades. Go ahead. And as you can see, in 1993, about 9% of the students went to private unaided schools, and that's up to about 35% today. In percentage terms, the private aided sector has actually lost share, but in absolute terms, it's sort of been flattish. And the government system really has lost share at a fairly fast pace. And in more recent years, particularly the last 6, 7, 8 years, and Geeta Kingdon's work has pointed this out clearly, but you can see it in the DICE data, is in absolute terms, the government system has actually been losing children. So a number of children in the system has been declining. I've talked about this earlier. This perception around these schools being elite schools is completely a myth. 45% of the children go to schools which charge less than 500 rupees a month. So these are truly budget private schools. And I don't think the sort of inputs framework we have, the mandates, really take into account this fact. Moving ahead, what you see is there's significant variation in terms of market share of private schools across states. So you've got states like Bengal and Bihar, where the share is close to 15%, but places like Goa, where it's north of 75%. It's generally the higher income states where private market share is higher. Of course, states like UP are an aberration, where private market share is north of 60%, even though GDP per capita is quite low. And of course, there are other factors at work in terms of the market share. I think one important point I do want to make is that government schools are much smaller units. They're very fragmented. I know there's a lot of conversation around consolidating government schools, which is politically very hard. But as they've been hollowed out, and as we built out more of these schools, the average unit size is only about 120 students. And when we talk about primary government schools, it's even smaller. And for private schools, it's about 2x that. I think it's important to note that even though there are marginal gains in terms of learning outcomes, they're doing this at a fraction of the cost of government schools in terms of per pupil cost or expenditure. I think one important point that I want to make, and we're doing some work on this now, is sort of constructing the P&L of a median school. And you can almost do this in your head. If the median school fee is about 600 rupees and all in, it may be closer to 1,000 rupees a month. and the school has about 250 children, you can see that the revenue is about 30 lakhs. And even at an EBITDA margin of about 40% or 50%, really what the school owner is getting is about 12 lakhs or 15 lakhs, which is really the implicit wage after taking all the risks of running a school, not getting paid during COVID times, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when people talk about sort of these private sector entrepreneurs, rampant commercialization, it's important to keep in mind the unit size, the economics, and what really does a private school entrepreneur take home on an annual basis. I think it's an important point to note. I think a lot of us think that parents pick private schools solely because they're English medium. But interestingly, when you look at the sort of data from NSSO, what you find is that 73% are actually looking at private schools because they believe that learning or the teaching learning process is significantly better in private schools. So that's the basis on which they are making the decision. They don't have a learning marker per se, but that's their perception. And then what you can see, which is, I think, true for the public system and also the private system, is across the socioeconomic spectrum, there is a fairly large, learning gap between the lowest quintile and the highest quintile. And it's consistent across the public system and the private system. The gender gap exists in terms of percentage of, there's always this issue of parents prefer that their boy child goes to private school versus girls. It's about, there's a delta of 6 percentage points. But the delta is much more significant when it comes to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in terms of percentage of those students attending private schools. I'll skip over most of this only to say that there was much talk about this RTE section 12(1)(c), where 25% of the seats were to be reserved for private schools. The implementation, I think, as many of you know, has been very spotty, and only a fraction of the seats have been filled. The monitoring of this has been abysmal. And frankly, some studies around impact a couple of people have done have showed that not much has really happened. And so this has not been implemented very well. If I look at some of the key challenges within the private sector, clearly there are two I'll focus on. One is the regulation, the heavy hand of the state, and the license Raj, which I talked about earlier. And the second is the lack of information, or the information asymmetry. And therefore, whilst parents are making a choice, are they really able to make an informed choice? And if we want markets to really work well, we need to work on both these issues. Moving ahead, I think what you see on the regulatory front, and Mr. Swarup talked about one aspect of it, which is how do you look at fees and particularly fee increments, but there are a number of other aspects in terms of, the regulation with regards to opening a school and the friction costs there, or the day-to-day operations, or even looking at access to credit and other issues. Central Square Foundation is actually working right now with Niti Aayog to put out a model document. We had worked with FICCI Arise, and they had done great work along with Amachal Makaldas in terms of drafting a model act. But making some modifications, we're actually going to be launching something along with NITI, which will then be sent to all states in India, and we hope we can then push for greater adoption across many states. As you know, some states have gone the other way in terms of regulating fees, which really impact the top 5-10% of students. And so frankly, I don't know what they're really trying to achieve through the fee regulation. Going ahead, with regards to the information asymmetry, I think there clearly is poor information quality. There is no learning marker that students have. And so really, what is the incentive for these private school owners to improve learning outcomes? And this is a key issue in terms of trying to solve this. We had worked with Karthik and Abhijit on doing a pilot in Prakasam district in Andhra Pradesh. We really looked to see if we could collect high quality data using the public system, using technology, using tabs. And that was achieved, and an RCT was done on that. Now we need to go the next step in terms, which was a universal, sort of a census exam, 4th grade across private and government. And now we need to figure out how we can get this information across to parents in a way where it's digestible and they get the relevant information in terms of not only their school, but the surrounding schools, where the socioeconomic dynamics are fairly similar. And so we're going to be working on that, a couple of pilots with CBSE and a state or two, to look at this information asymmetry issue. And Farzana can talk about this because she's done the research on this. COVID-19 impact is very severe on private schools. I think all of you know that there's a big impact, and we've seen the data that fee collection, depending on the state or depending on the school type, up anywhere from 5 to 50% of the fees are being collected. And so there's a real crisis here. And obviously, as a result, teachers are not being paid, and working capital challenges, and there's closures, and we don't know what exactly will happen coming out of COVID for this sector. We know that some of the lenders to this sector are really in distress. And so I don't know what they will do in terms of trying to foreclose on some of the credit issues that they have. But there's some real pain. There's a real pain in this sector and distress in this sector at this point in time. Moving ahead in terms of pathways for reform, let's move ahead. And I just want to point out there are many other countries that have looked at this. I mean, the UK, for instance, with Ofsted, regulatory independence, a great model, but also in countries like Tanzania. I'll touch on learning outcome measurement and information disclosure, where I think Chile is really a role model, but there are other countries doing this as well. And then vouchers I won't come to because I'm not sure that's really the solution here in India at this point, given the incremental costs. Chile, I do want to point out that they've been very systematic in terms of having this learning marker. Students in grade 4 are assessed every year, and then grade 8 and 10 every alternate year. So you have a learning marker in the earlier years and then a learning marker sort of later. And that's what's disclosed to parents in the form of school reports. And then owners really look to improve their outcomes. And there's a real incentive based on sort of this learning marker. And this has really worked in the context of Chile. And so it's an important model for us to look at. And I think many of you know that Chile had some problems in the early days with its voucher system, but then really has improved thereafter. Moving on. So I think net, we come out in this report really arguing that there are 5 key reform pillars. The first is to have a universal learning indicator. I know Mr. Swarup was talking down the board exams for 3rd, 5th, and 8th, but our issue is whether it could just be one grade, maybe class 5. What's important to have a learning marker, a census exam that's high fidelity, not a board exam, but something that's high fidelity, which is more sort of competency based, so that there is a learning marker. Most of these schools don't go to 10th grade. So I think it's important we get the learning marker a little bit earlier because we know learning breaks down early. The second is a pragmatic accreditation framework. Third is an independent regulatory agency. There is some talk of that in NEP, but ensuring that there are sort of third-party assessors as part of this process. The fourth is to look at this not-for-profit mandate. I mean, really, the sector is operating on a for-profit basis, and so let's call a spade, and find a way to regularize this to some extent. And finally, to strengthen the RTE section 12.1c, because it really is not working in terms of implementation on the ground. So these are the 5 areas we call out. I think what we really want is, from a service provider standpoint, is greater focus on quality, which a push from the parents as they have as this information asymmetry is collapsed. Obviously, for better, higher quality folks to want to get into the sector, for credit to be able to flow, for the license routes to go away, and for the government really to take cognizance that they need to look at all children. If half the children go to private schools, we really need to look at how we're systemically going to address this issue. What should the department be doing? Do we need to bust up the department to service provider, department, and potentially some kind of quality assurance body? So I'll just stop there, Shekhar, and I'm happy to take questions after Karthik and Farzana have spoken.
Thank you, Ashish. I think this is a extremely timely report with the new education policy. I think it raises fundamental questions of the approach, the way in which the data are being produced and analyzed, and simply understanding the scale of the problem that if we don't deal with, will come and bite us over many, many, many years. So I think it's very appropriate that this has come out. And I also want to thank the Omidyar Network India, which has been your partner in this work. Very important that they are taking such a strong interest in this. Over to Karthik then.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So I guess I have only about 10 to 15 minutes. And so in the interest of time, I have not actually prepared slides. But let me start, first of all, by congratulating CSF and the Omidyar Network for putting together, I think, just an exceptional report. And, you know, it's one of these things where we are flying blind in the sense of not even knowing the basic facts with regard to what's going on in the sector. And partly because private schools are so fragmented, partly because, you know, DICE gives us some data that's not always verified. Pratham provides some data from household surveys, but that's only rural India. So, you know, frankly, even in terms of understanding the landscape of where we are, you know, sometimes the most important work is just descriptive work about the state of play. And I think this is a really, really important contribution to the larger discourse on not just private schools, but education more broadly. And, you know, just to provide a sense of, in fact, in health, most of my work has been in education, but the parallels with health are remarkable, right? Where if you look at the household survey data, you'll see that about 70% of primary healthcare is sought with the fee charging private sector. And Jishnu Das and I with co-authors have a recent paper out on this. And we have absolutely no idea of the supply side on healthcare. Who are these providers? And, you know, we did the first All India representative estimate of just supply side and showed that about 50-60% of these providers are unqualified but still provide better service. And so in that sense, you're going to see many parallels with the education sector, and, you know, I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think the larger story of service delivery in India is the same regardless of whether we're talking about education or health, which is a gradual and increasing exit to the private sector. And this is happening in the context of increasing budgets, or at least, you know, budgetary allocations per student that are certainly going up, because even if you're preserving your level of public expenditure as a fraction of GDP, as the number of students are exiting to the private sector, the per student spending in the private sector, in the public sector, is unambiguously going up. Okay, so, you know, so one way of thinking about the crisis of quality we have in the public sector is to ask, what does it say about the quality of your product that you can't even give it away for free? Okay, so, you know, here you have a free product, free public education, free health, and you have people essentially voting with their feet, paying 10, 20, 25% of monthly income out of their pockets to go to these private schools. Okay, so, and to the extent that we believe that parents and consumers have some idea of what's in their best interest, it's a massive indictment on the quality of public service delivery. Now, this is not to say, therefore, that we give up on the public sector. In fact, a lot of my work talks about how the best way to improve the private sector is to actually improve the public sector, because then these are actually complements and not substitutes, because you're forcing then the private sector to respond. But I think I just want to put on record how important it is that we take the private sector as seriously as the public sector, because at least half of our children are now being educated over here. Okay, so I think I agree with a lot of what's in the report, in the recommendations. I think it's a very thoughtful piece of work and recommend it to everybody. Also, for those who want more details, I have written an extensive paper last year on the state and the market in education, where we talk about principles, evidence, as well as the way forward, and I recommend that. So I think for today, in my 10 odd minutes, I just want to say a few big picture things and then talk about some critical ideas to implement. So I think it's useful to first understand, why is our entire approach to private schools so confused? Okay, so and the irony here is that 50% of the population, close to 50%, is using these private schools, but the policy environment is still characterized by, if not outright hostility, at least a deep level of suspicion and skepticism regarding the private sector. And so I think it's just useful to understand that part of the schizophrenia comes from the fact that government plays three very different roles in kind of shaping the landscape of private providers, right? So, and the important point is that the way you see the private sector is very different in these three roles. So the government is a policy maker that is establishing budgets, frameworks, goals, and approaches. The government is a regulator and the government is also a provider, okay? And the problem is that the role of the private sector is very different in these three roles, right? So as a policy maker, the private sector is an ally, because as a policy maker, your goal should be, how do I ensure maximum quality education for all children in the country at a given cost, so that I'm maximizing what we're delivering for a given amount of cost. And in that role, the private sector is an ally, because it is expanding the set of feasible options. And if you look at many precedents around the world, if you look at, say, defense contracting in the US, so where the private sector is an ally, where the government actually says the private sector is important for me to encourage, because my goal is to ensure quality education regardless of who the provider is, okay? Now, in the second role as regulator, the private sector is an equal to the government, because you want to treat all players equally and kind of impose comparable regulatory expectations regardless of whether the provider is public or private. Whereas the government as provider, if you think of yourself as running a school education department, now the private sector is a competitor, because you're actually competing for the same market share with the students, okay? And so what ends up happening within the government is, because the government as provider accounts for 90%, if not more, of the staffing of the government, whether it's the teachers, whether it's the entire education machinery. So the government as provider, the thinking of government as provider tends to dominate the entire government view with regard to how the private sector should be handled, which means that because the private sector is seen as this competitor, is seen as profit making, you kind of have this deep distrust, which then permeates how the government interacts with the private sector. So I think, coming back to, and like Mr. Swarup said, in the end, yes, you need concrete action plans, but it is like as Keynes famously said, like most practical people are also usually slaves of some defunct economist. So in that sense, starting with the principles, if you want to understand why policy is the way it is, it's useful to use the framework of ideas, interests, and institutions, right? And multiple former chief economic advisors have told me how, we often blame vested interests, but often the biggest problem is just bad ideas, bad ossified ideas that are not kind of backed up by the data. And I think if we want to make progress here, the first and most important thing we need to do is just clear the cobweb of bad ideas, right? Meaning that occupies how we think with regard to the private sector in service delivery. And if we can, and a report like this does a huge job in terms of just highlighting the sheer importance of the private sector to educating all our children, and the importance of getting policymakers to understand that your role is not just running the government school system. Your role is to ensure that every Indian child has a quality education, and that as a system, we are maximizing what we are delivering for every rupee spent, okay? So I think starting with that clarity of ideas, I think is super important, that the private sector is an ally as opposed to an adversary. Of course, you still need to regulate, you still need to make sure that certain disclosure norms are met, and I'll come back to that. But overall, at a policy level, the private sector is an ally. So just, let's kind of, for those of us old enough, or at least I was in my teens in the 80s, it's important to remember, right, that most of our problems in India come from supply side shortages. If you go back to the 80s, it's still not that long ago that we used to be in waiting lists for 2 years to get a car or get a telephone or get the most basic things. And the way we've solved that problem is essentially by unleashing supply. And most of the problems in India are about undersupply of quality at a given price. And so if you can unleash supply, you're going to do a lot more for the long-term health of outcomes. And that's kind of my broad view with regard to education as well. Okay. Now, but when it comes to interest, clearly there are a few vested interests, like Mr. Swarup was saying, that because you've created this very perverse kind of regulatory environment where the regulatory burdens are so onerous that honest high quality operators are almost selected out, because you cannot operate in this environment without being willing to kind of grease a few palms to get your certificates and get your regulation. And so you kind of end up with this perverse negative selection where the good folks will not participate, whereas the folks who are left are the ones who are willing to either grease the wheels or are connected. And so that creates its own set of vested interests in preserving the status quo, whereby you create legal and regulatory barriers to high quality supply that allows those who have captured certain elements of kind of the regulatory process to continue. And so that creates a very corrosive environment for private schools, because you either the fact that to operate, you need to be in violation of what is written already puts you on the defensive with regard to how you're functioning in the larger ecosystem. Okay, so I think from an interest perspective, it is important to recognize that the 50% of parents who are now engaging in private schools constitute an incredibly important interest group. And so to the extent that that's a countervailing force that is able to help with certain aspects of quality and expanding supply, I think, that really needs to be accounted for. And then finally, there's institutions. And so, and here the legal frameworks within which we operate, I think, will cast a very long shadow with regard to how the larger private school system works. So, in my last 5 minutes, let me just talk about key ideas, right? So something I've already mentioned in many of my papers, which is repeated by Ashish, is that our approach to regulation of private schools really needs to shift to disclosure as opposed to mandates, right? Which is to say, there is an important regulatory role in terms of ensuring transparency, because there is asymmetry of information and parents are making choices without full information. But if you focus on disclosure, then you're not getting into the micromanagement of saying every school needs to have this many, square meters of playground, or this many classrooms, or this structure of teachers. Because frankly, in some settings, you can get better education quality by having, less qualified teachers, but having more such teachers. Okay, so the operating model of private schools around the country, and what a lot of my research shows, is that you employ less qualified teachers, but because the salaries are lower, you hire many more teachers, which allows you to reduce multi-grade teaching, improve attention to individual children, and deliver comparable or better improvements in learning outcomes at a much lower cost per child. So rather than second guessing how the private school chooses to optimize its inputs, if we have an approach that says, if you lie, we will crack down on you, but as long as you're fully transparently disclosing what you're doing, that the regulation will take a much lighter touch. I think, just making that one change, I think, will have a huge positive impact on the ecosystem. Now, the next point is that there is a case for better investment in public goods, including measurement and reporting of learning outcomes. Okay, so this is a sense where, there is an important role for the regulator. The private sector is not a panacea, like, with regard to all of the market failures that we know that happen. But again, sunshine is the best disinfectant, and Jishnu Das has some really powerful work. Jishnu and Asam Khwaja have been working in Pakistan for over 10 years. And, what they found is just having report cards that provide information of how every school is doing to a community has had long-lasting positive effects, because it kind of creates pressure to respond to that information. So a regulatory structure that is not just emphasizing disclosure, but also investing in independent measurement of learning outcomes, and over time, perhaps even value added, will have a huge positive effect on the larger ecosystem. And I think, it actually makes sense, like Ashish was saying, to think about these private schools really as small and medium enterprises, right? So, in some ways, supporting small and medium enterprises is kind of, it's almost like, it's a truism that every policymaker wants to support MSMEs. Everybody's thinking about how do you encourage MSMEs in a COVID environment, but these schools really are large MSMEs that generate both value and employment, and is a sector that is in deep distress. And so thinking therefore about this whole sector as a dynamic source of both value creation and employment, I think can help change the mindset with how we treat private schools. And I think more generally, like I said, the focus of policy should be on expanding high quality supply, regardless of whether it's public or private. So the last point I want to make is these ideas I've talked about are all about expanding the supply, but it doesn't solve your problem that private schools are still fee charging entities, and therefore you need, to the extent that there is an equity mandate in policy, you do need to think hard about how do you make these options available to children who cannot pay, and so that you're not ending up with a highly socioeconomically stratified education system. Okay, now RTE 12C attempts to do this. I think, like Ashish has said, in practice, the implementation has been incredibly patchy and has become another source of distress to schools, because if you're not getting reimbursed, then, or reimbursed on time, then effectively this is almost like you're confiscating capacity rather than kind of expanding it. And so in that sense, I think the way it's been implemented, I would personally prefer an approach that is based not on coercion, but that says, if we've given you land, then of course there's an expectation. But if the government has not given you any land, then the way the RTE clause could work work is more to say that here is the amount of reimbursement, and the schools should have some say in how many seats they will offer, because over time, if the contract is appropriately structured, the schools will actually want to do more of this. There's also more we can do to improve RTE Clause 12 implementation in terms of the awareness side, because what a bunch of research is showing is that the people who are availing of this for the most part tend to be people who would have gone to private schools anyway. So in that sense, it seems to be a direct transfer of subsidy to people who could afford private schools, as opposed to encouraging access among the most marginalized groups. And then the last point I want to make is, if you look at the research around the world in terms of promising models that combine public financing for access and private provision for management quality, I do think the time has come for India to have a charter school policy that, or at least a charter school pilot policy that encourages because you're seeing an increasing set of high quality non-profit school operators, everybody from Akanksha to People to Madi to, there's many high quality folks who are running schools, government schools for low income populations at a per child cost that is less than what the government is spending and delivering substantially better outcomes. Okay, so in a way, what I would like to see is that we almost have a grand challenge that invites motivated non-profit school operators to come and say that if the government were to provide you a reimbursement equal to the per child variable cost that we have, how far can we push out the learning, how far can we push out quality and learning outcomes? Now, again, there's a bunch of complex regulatory issues, and I've dealt with this in detail. So let me refer you to one paper and one podcast. The paper is on the state and the market in education policy, where I discuss these ideas in more detail. And I also did a very detailed 3-hour plus podcast about a month and a half ago on multiple aspects of education policy, where the last 45 minutes focuses on leveraging private schools for the public good. So let me stop there and congratulate again CSF and Omidyar for putting together an excellent report.
And thank you, Karthik. Your comments are always packed with just so many ideas and thoughts. And I particularly value the idea that you ended with, which is this grand challenge idea, where you let quality surface. It always strikes me as incredibly difficult to digest that in infrastructure, we've decided that for physical capital, we absolutely need to have public-private partnerships. But for what is far more important for our country, with its demographics particularly, in the context of human capital, we are still not comfortable with the idea that the private sector has a dramatically important role to play. And I think this report brings home that the scale is just too large for us to ignore it anymore. And we are simply wasting an opportunity, incentives, the whole range of things that could dramatically improve what future generations of school children will get out of our education system. With that, let me turn to Farzana. We are at 8 o'clock. We have half an hour more. I may, with the permission of all our attendees as well as our panelists, stretch this a little bit more. This is so powerful a discussion that I think we need to stay with it for a bit longer. But before that, Farzana, please.
So I'm going to be sharing my screen for some slides I have. Okay, so everybody can see this and you can hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, of course, I'm going to re-emphasize many of the things that the panelists before me and Mr. Swarup had talked about earlier, which is that this is an extremely timely report. And I think there are some aspects of private schooling that in India we do not recognize, which this report is bringing to the forefront. So the first aspect is the tremendous growth in private schools, not just in terms of the number of schools, but also in the proportion of students who are enrolling in these schools. And it is going to be now, as the report points out, it's half of the students of this particular, in the school age group are enrolling in private schools relative to public schools in India. And I think something that is, typically people don't focus on, again, is thinking of private schools as a homogeneous entity in terms of the quality, in terms of the administration, in terms of the cost of these schools, which I think this report is doing beautifully in terms of highlighting the fact that the nature of private schools is very heterogeneous relative to public schools, which tend to be more homogeneous in nature because they're more standardized and they are regulated by the government. Both in terms of administration, you have aided versus unaided schools. The cost, there's tremendous variation. There are schools which are private schools which are very close in terms of the fees they charge to the public schools, but they offer something more to as an aspirational population in terms of the quality, or it be English medium teaching, and the variation in learning outcomes. So the general understanding is that learning outcomes on average are higher in private schools as opposed to public schools. But some of the research, would suggest that that is not correct. And that again, the report is bringing to the fore. And I think that is extremely important because we need to start focusing on the private school sector. So what I feel the report is really emphasizing is the relative paucity of research on private schools. We have tremendous amount of research on the public schooling system, and we have some on the private schooling system, but from the household perspective. We know very little about inputs, about incentives, as well as what drives these private schools. And I think that is extremely important, and for us to understand how we can influence the nature of these schools so that, as Karthik pointed out, that every child in the country gets equal opportunities and good learning from the school system. So just to focus in terms of the school inputs and incentives, we are talking a lot about accountability. So often, this lack of accountability is cited as a reason for poor education services that are being provided. And the focus has been on accountability being lacking from the public sector perspective. But this is also a concern for the private sector as well, which I think research, at least from an academic perspective, has not focused on, because when we talk about accountability, then we are, essentially focused on the fact that you have certain resources that are given to you or guaranteed, and your salary is guaranteed, and therefore there is limited accountability for the public sector. Whereas for the private sector, per se, by its very definition, there should be higher accountability, because their survival, so to speak, depends upon their performance. But yet there is a concern for the private sector. And again, I think that is something that the report brings to the fore in terms of the lower learning outcomes than perceived publicly in of the private sector. And I think there is another thing that we need to be aware of over here is that there are two factors that determine school inputs. One is this accountability, and the other is what is the incentives that these schools have in order to provide a good service, the good quality service. And here again, we have to talk about stakeholder awareness, which is the awareness essentially of the households, which can often coexist with this deficit in accountability in the provision of education. And this awareness deficit also exists in the private sector. So typically, people again are of the opinion that parents who send their kids to the private sector are more aware. Yes, of course, on average, that would be true that they would be more aware, but there does exist an awareness deficit in the private sector as well, in terms of evaluating the quality of the schooling, the quality of the learning that their children are getting. And so in that context, what I want to do is juxtapose what we see in the public sector and juxtapose it with the private sector on these criteria. So, I'm building on the work that, Ashish referred to in his report here. So when we're thinking in terms of school inputs, typically we think that private schools have more resources, but that's not necessarily true. So if you look at this panel in terms of, a bunch of schools that we've looked at in rural Rajasthan, you don't see any big differences, for example, here, any significant differences in the infrastructure index or, the quality of the teachers in terms of their graduation level, or a very big difference in terms of pupil-teacher ratios. But there is a difference in terms of what you can call sort of accountability. I'm not sure that we can actually call it accountability, but of course there is a SMC that exists. They are going to hire more local teachers, and that may create greater accountability because you are part of the community to which you are catering in terms of providing these services. And as we can see, and also the work that Karthik has done, which is that the monthly teacher salaries tend to be very low as opposed to the public sector. But what I wanted you to take away from this is that in terms of the infrastructure, it is not necessarily the case that the private sector is way better than the public sector is. And what is very interesting is in terms of when you think of parental awareness, there is this divergence between parental perceptions of what the student or their child is learning and the actual student performance. So then this again is based on the data that we collected, where we designed and administered the test to the children and then asked the parents about what their perception was on each of these different scholastic skills of what the child, what the learning level of the child is. And what you can see over here quite clearly is that, of course, it is true that the difference in terms of parental perception, or the gap in the parental perception and student performance, is much greater for the public schools. But it isn't non-existent for the private sector. It does exist, and it is significant in many of these skill outcomes. So again, what this reinforces what the report is talking about in terms of the need for assessing quality and the need for assessing learning levels of the private schools. But that is not sufficient. How do we disseminate that information to the household so that they're able to evaluate or to be able to make a choice in terms of the schools that they are sending their kids to? And then finally, when we talk about school incentives, private school households do, of course, they are less disadvantaged in terms of their incomes and their background, and they are paying higher tuition. So for example, when you look at education expenditures, it can be up to 6 times of the education expenditures that are being made for households which are sending their kids to the public schooling system. But again, as we discussed, this tremendous variation here in terms of the fee structure, and there would be, a much larger distribution or a wider distribution that you would see. And all of this, I think, gets reflected in terms of learning outcomes. So if you look here in terms of, the scores in Hindi, math, and English, which is what we had administered, and the green bars show you the performance of the public schools, which, as you would expect, is to the left. The distribution is more skewed to the left as opposed to the private schools. But what is interesting here, what you see is that if you look at what is the performance of the highest percentiles, and the gap between that and those who are the worst performers, that gap is much bigger in the private schools than it is for the public schools. So the distribution is sort of more flat for the public schools as opposed to the private schools. So that again points to the fact that there is a great amount of dispersion in learning. And that needs to be addressed, because you need to make this private schooling system more homogeneous. And a lot of this low accountability is happening in the left tail of the distribution, which are mostly, fly-by-night private school operators, who are not able to sustain themselves over long periods, right? So the question is higher accountability effective in improving learning outcomes? So what do we mean by accountability? Essentially, when we're thinking of accountability here, we are thinking of accountability in terms of learning outcomes, not necessarily in terms of regulation, because regulation does not itself imply accountability to consumers. And as I pointed out earlier, the awareness of the stakeholders affects the incentives that the service provider has in terms of the accountability and the quality of the service that is being provided. And there is mixed evidence on whether accountability actually improves learning outcomes or not. And I think this was also pointed out by Mr. Swarup when he was talking about how people would game the system and so on and so forth, which has been the experience in the US. There have been positive experiences and there have been negative experiences. So what is the role of information in improving accountability? So in the US system or in the Western system, we've known that, there are these certain legislations which are brought in, which is to improve accountability, but then there is these mixed results that you get. But can there be some role for information in terms of the quality of schooling in improving accountability? And the World Bank has focused on this tremendously in terms of the importance of improving choice, participation, and the voice, especially of the households, in improving learning outcomes. And I think this was referred to, the work that Karthik referred to, which is in Pakistan by Jishnu and co-authors, which is a long-run study, points to the fact that yes, information can be very effective, but we have some other work, earlier work, which suggested that no, providing information to households may not be effective, even particularly when you're looking at the public school system. So what we were trying to do over here in this particular, study essentially is telling us that there is something which, we need to understand about the nature of the information and how that interacts with the incentives of the providers to think about whether the information on the quality of schooling can be an effective instrument in terms of improving learning outcomes, whether it be for private schools or it be for public schools, because the two schooling systems have completely different incentive structures. But what is it about this nature of information that may matter? So what type of information may be effective? And essentially what we find in this randomized study that we did was that providing information on relative school performance, and typically that is not something that we think about when we think about school performance. You evaluate a student, you tell the student, okay, this is how your performance is, but where does the student stand in the distribution within the class, but in the distribution in the entire community, in the choice set that is available to the student, and how that might align with the incentives of the school. So the private schools might have an incentive to respond to this sort of information because their very survival depends on it, whereas the public schools may not have. But I think that is important here to point out that, as Ashish said, that you want to improve the private schooling system because that may create competition for the public schooling system also to step up and to improve its delivery of the public service. So before I go to the last slide, I think and I seriously think that this is what the report here is doing, is if the report is successful in helping us agree on the fact that there is a need to assess private schools, I think that consensus is very important. And I think we're very close to that consensus. The first step is that, and the second step is get a framework for this assessment. And this is exactly what Mr. Swarup was referring to. What is going to be the framework for a legislation that would assess private schools? Who will do the assessment? What will be assessed? So it's not just learning outcomes that parents care about. Parents also care about the fee structure. They also care about the infrastructure. They also care about things like discipline and so on and so forth. So that's number one. Do we agree on the fact that they need to assess? I think yes. And next, we need a framework. We need policymakers to sit down with researchers and practitioners to agree on the framework outside independent accreditation authority. What aspects will be assessed and what would be the process of assessing it so that it is independent. And finally, I think what I'm talking about is becomes relevant now. How do we disseminate that information? Once the assessment happens, do we just pack it away and put it somewhere, or do we provide it to the public in a public platform which creates a ranking for the schooling system, which of course does exist for the tertiary sector, for example, but doesn't exist at the primary level and the secondary level. And I think this is now where we need to push that. And finally, when we talk about the new education policy and COVID-19 going forward, I think, again, the report is very timely because of the NEP is emphasizing on learning outcomes as opposed to inputs. And I think something that is missing which we do need to focus on, is this emphasis on early childhood education. And private school players are big players, particularly in the urban sector. Again, something that Mr. Swarup referred to, but they're largely unregulated. And this is going to be key, because a lot of research now tells us how key early childhood education is in terms of longer learning outcomes. And I think this also pushes us into the direction of thinking of what is going on with the pandemic and the post-pandemic impacts in terms of the divergence in the learning outcomes between private and public schools. Should we worry about the fact that this divergence in terms of averages is going to increase, between the private and the public schooling system, but also within the private schooling system itself, given that there is a lot of variation that already exists, that the variance is large between the sort of bad private schools, if you want to call it that, versus the good private schools, the sought after ones, the stars, then is that going to widen? And that's something that we have to worry about. And I think that is again something that Ashish referred to in terms of demand for private schoolings. If there is this income shock that we are experiencing, the economy is shrinking, what's going to happen to the demand for private schools? Are we going to see a similar trend in terms of increase in private school enrollments? And the question arises about the sustainability of these private schools. And a large proportion, as again the report points out, are very low fee schools which are on the margins of existence, and many of them may not exist as a result of this pandemic. And so what are those implications for private schools? I think there will be major changes that we might see in terms of this transition that we have been seeing from the public schooling system to the private schooling system. And I think this is a rich area for research, and we need to continue focusing on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana. Your emphasis on accountability, and Karthik knows this well, led me to pull out something that was done now, 16 years back, and I'm referring, of course, to the World Development Report of 2004 that actually made the link between accountability, voice, and the relationship between the policymaker and the provider. And sadly, we are advanced in our thinking about how accountability works, but many of the elements that were emphasized 16 years back still remain to be dealt with. And I think the emphasis on disclosure rather than mandates, which you referred to and also then Karthik referred to, I hope that this report is the first step towards that. And that leads me to ask Ashish. By the way, we have a whole ton of questions in the Q&A box. There are 21 I see. Some are overlapping. If you feel comfortable, please go ahead and respond to them. We will aggregate them and certainly pass them on to you. And if people have given their names, we have their email addresses. So we are in a position to respond to them, even if we don't have time in this particular session. But Ashish, how do you see the next steps panning out? And what would you recommend other think tanks and researchers in this area, practitioners in government, the ministry itself and the Department of School Education itself? Where do you see this report now leading us?
Yeah. So in fact, we at CSF are working on 3 areas going forward, because we don't want this to just be a report that gathers dust. So I think the 3 areas of first is, Shekhar, is narrative building. I think it is important to take this out to a much wider audience and build a narrative for private schools that, look, these are not elite schools, and that half our children are there. And so we do need to address this issue. They are all, when we look as a state government at the education system, we need to look at all children, not just the children in government schools. So I think this narrative building, using these data points from the report down at the state level with broader audiences, building the surround sound, I think is important. Second is around regulation. I mentioned earlier that we've been working with Niti Aayog on a model act. So we had worked earlier with FICCI Arise. They had done a good job in creating along with Amarchand Mangaldas, we had drafted sort of paragraph by paragraph an act. UP adopted a variation of it. And the idea was to get buy-in from NITI around some kind of model act, which then states could sort of look at. But it's not just to stop there. Once the model act is out, which will be soon, to actually go out to state governments and work with them to try to now embed this, much like UP has done, so that we move away from the license Raj, lighter touch regulation, less inputs-based regulation, and towards greater transparency, disclosure, and some of the other principles I touched on around the friction costs or fee-related issues, etc., all in that model act. A third is around this information asymmetry. So I talked about the Prakasham district experiment. We've now been talking to CBSE to look at this idea of and I must say that Mr. Manoj Ahuja, who's the chairperson CBSE, has been working with us on it. The idea of putting in place a key stage exam. So if you look at countries like Chile, I pointed out, even the UK has various key stage exams. It's a learning marker that as Farzana said, if we want to solve this information asymmetry issue, we need a robust and valid learning marker. So working with CBSE, but also working with 1 or 2 state governments at getting this census exam done with high degree of fidelity, 4th or 5th grade, and then using that learning marker, disseminating it to parents, doing it at scale, doing Farzana's experiment in Ajmer, at scale, and trying to see if we can solve this information asymmetry issue. So these are the 3 issues: the narrative building, changing the regulatory climate, and as part of that, of course, pushing for what's in NEP, the sort of busting up of the department and having a body that looks at quality assurance. And then finally, this issue around information asymmetry.
That's very useful, Ashish. I should mention that you have extensively used data that NCAER produces from the India Human Development Survey. And I've been talking to the IHDS team at NCAER. While you've relied mostly on the household data, there's of course details from the school survey as well that would add to the analysis and the pictorials and the data visualization that you presented. So that certainly would be something that could be done right away because the data exists. But much more importantly, in my conversations with the team and looking to your report, in the upcoming round of the IHDS, the school component of the survey has been substantially revised, and the focus will go well beyond infrastructure to collecting information on school management, support from cluster resource centers or block resource centers, mechanisms of school accountability through the school management committee, village education committee, language policy, a whole range of medium of instruction versus third language versus grade in which English is introduced in the school, references to section 12(1)(c). So there's going to be an extensive coverage of many of the issues that you are dealing with. So we're really looking forward to the richness of this data when it comes out. And I think it's going to, because it's a panel and because it provides the kind of depth that has been missing so far, that should significantly help in this information asymmetry work. And I urge CSF and others to please look at that as well.
Yeah. Shekhar, the only thing I want to point out there is I think all this information is great. I think what we need is that learning marker. And it'll have to be a census exam is the only way you can get a learning marker that you can then that normalizes and then, as Farzana was saying, you can look at relative performance. Because really what we want parents to focus on is learning outcomes. I mean, the other factors are great, but there's still many of those are hygiene factors.
No, absolutely. Unfortunately, the census is already kind of firmed up. The questionnaires are all done. The household questionnaire, the enumeration questionnaire is done. But you should talk to the RGI. Vivek Joshi may be able to, given the delay, since now it's going to be census 2022 rather than 2021. The house listing won't start till April, and then the enumeration won't be till February 2022. So maybe at a very high level, if a decision is made that we should add a marker question or two questions to the enumeration questionnaire. That might be a dramatic move forward in thinking about learning outcomes and doing the kind of marker work that you are thinking of. We are at 8:30. With your permission and with the permission of the attendees who are still with us, I'll stretch this a little bit longer just so that we have the chance for Karthik and Farzana to come in. And as I said, we'll value very much the Q&A that has been, the questions that have been put up. We'll share them with CSF, and of course, we will try to respond to them if you've given your name. Karthik?
Yeah, since we had time, let me just add a few concluding remarks. So, I think, thank you, first of all. I think it was an excellent panel. The only thing that should have been changed is ideally Mr. Swarup had come at the end, because he was still talking about making things happen. And, I think his comments are incredibly well taken. And I think I saw 2 or 3 questions in the chat about, so where do we go from here? I think that's a question you asked Ashish as well. So I think, as an academic, it is useful to take a step back and think about the larger kind of ecosystem and value chain from ideas to policy, right? So at one level, you have kind of the academics like me and Farzana who are doing deep long-term research. Our projects take 5 years, 6 years, where we're collecting an incredible amount of primary data. But then, the principles that come out of there then kind of get channeled through the think tanks like NCAER, like CSF, in terms of saying, now that when we have a policy window, how do you bring this thing together in a way that all of the primary research and the facts are reflected in the policy thinking? Because the academics are not inside the government ministries when the policies are being written, and then people in the ministries don't know who is the academic who's doing the best work. So in that sense, the CSF, NCAER, I guess NCAER slightly more on the research side, CSF slightly more on the action side, but occupying essentially this translation space between kind of both generating research and then making sure that gets translated, I think is incredibly important for India. And I think, I'm happy to see that happen. And then, like Mr. Swarup was saying, I think, the next level is then actually rolling up your sleeves and writing down model laws and model legislations that reflects, like he said, putting together the practitioners who understand the issues on the ground. I think the only pushback I would give him a little bit is that he probably doesn't see how much time the researchers actually spend on the ground, like, getting our shoes dirty. But, both Farzana and I can, can attest to that. But I do think the concrete next step here is, if we think that existing policy frameworks are completely, counterproductive, that they might be well-intentioned but counterproductive for a variety of reasons, you cannot beat something with nothing, right? However bad the status quo is, and this is true in politics, this is true in policy, that you cannot, you cannot criticize without having an alternative. So I think it's really important that a concrete next step out of this, and I'm happy to hear Ashish and CSF are working on this with Niti Aayog and others, is to say, what would a model private school kind of, regulation look like, or facilitation framework look like? Have that drafted and then get inputs from practitioners, and then take it to states and saying, here is the likely upside if you manage to get this right. And you are starting to see, states being willing to experiment. And I do think that would be a very useful, concrete way of going forward. And then there's another level of kind of translating the policy document and the law into something that improves outcomes on the ground. And that involves a next level of work with providers, with parents, and thinking about how, you translate some of these ideas into better action. But I think I'm just delighted to see the number of players in the Indian education ecosystem who are so deeply committed to working on all of these things. And I think having a concrete, this report is a wonderful first step. And I think implementing some of Mr. Swarup's ideas in the context of specific states, I think, would be a wonderful way to take this forward. And for people who want to know more, there were other questions about how I would deal with political opposition and stuff like that. Please do refer to the papers, which I have referred to on the podcast, and I'll put those again in the chat. And thanks again for creating this forum.
Farzana?
Yeah, I mean,
very quickly, please.
I'll just say a few lines. I think I'm very supportive of the steps that Ashish has outlined in terms of changing the narrative on the private schools' nature, and to push policy then to think of, creating an ecosystem where the outcomes at the private schools can improve. So I think these are really laudable outcomes, and I really do congratulate the CSF team in coming up with this report. And it's very heartening also, of course, from an academic's point of view, to see their work being translated at a larger policy scale, and that's fantastic.
So Ashish, you have a challenging path ahead. having embarked on a journey. I think everybody now expects you and organizations like mine to really push ahead and really break ground. Again, I'm thinking of the whole PPP experience in India with physical infrastructure, and potentially one possibility, two possibilities. One, we have the NEP, we have the work that you are doing with NITI, but just like, for example, on PPP, again, in infrastructure, we had a Vijay Kelkar committee that really looked at this in a very authoritative way with the full backing of the cabinet and the Ministry of Finance and others. And I think involving a larger set of players within government and giving expression to a commission or to a group of eminent people who will look at this in a specific way, as opposed to the way it's been treated in the NEP, I think might be a wonderful next step as well to think about. And NITI needs all the help that it can get, given that it's not an implementing agency, given that it doesn't have resources to back up what used to be the case with the Planning Commission. I think moving forces within government that really do have a major say in this in terms of resources and in terms of strategy would be extremely valuable. The other thought that comes to mind is, and here we are harking back to work we are doing on land records and property rights at NCAER, creating some kind of an index of achievement. And this could be done in a variety of different ways, but just looking at the compendium of state level data at the back of your report, those could easily be put together in some rigorous, reasonably rigorous way. Of course, it's not completely defensible always. You can always have variations, but creating an index of achievement and doing a domestic PISA-like standard can really move the needle when states start thinking about why am I behind and why am I ahead, and what do I need to do to stay ahead? What do I need to capture new ground and move ahead? We've seen some of the good aspects of the ease of doing business. We've seen some of the very bad aspects of the ease of doing business. But taking a balanced approach and thinking about both achievement markers as well as the aspirational values that they create might be worth thinking about. Again, not to trivialize it in any way. The problem is very complex, but certainly I think anything we can do to create incentives and political incentives at the state level could be dramatically important. And the states clearly are going to lead the way in making progress with that. So with that, let me, we are at 8:35. I'm going to close this very interesting webinar. I'm so glad, Ashish, you reached out and we put this together. I want to thank your colleagues at Central Square Foundation.
Thank you, Shekhar.
And I want to thank Omidyar Network India, Rupa Kudwa and her group, and of course all the NCR colleagues who've been behind this and made this possible. Thank you all for joining, and I'd like to thank very much our attendees. We had over 100 during this webinar. Thank you all for your questions. Do please remain engaged. Do please read the report. It is really important that each of us go out and become ambassadors for the kind of thinking that the report encourages us to develop and then implement. With that, let me say a good night to everybody. Those of us who are in other time zones like Karthik and I, it's really good morning. But thank you all for joining again, and we look forward to further such discussions around this very important topic of how to get learning and to get learning outcomes in private schools in India. Thank you again and good night. Bye-bye.